have Madeline Kerr. Catherine Bradley, Madeline's instructor, nominated her because of her outstanding work during the fall semester and said that Madeline's advocate speech highlights how to construct a well-crafted argument and how to support that argument with ample evidence. Please welcome Madeline to the stage.
Mathematic.
The overturning of Roe v. Wade back in June caused massive political discourse and really impacted the approval rating of our Supreme Court. In fact, according to Pew Research Center, only 48% of Americans have a favorable view of the Supreme Court. Now, many people are calling for justices to have term limits in favor of lifetime appointments. However, term limits for the Supreme Court justices should not be put into place because it would not have the intended effect. Our government today already has enough difficulty with partisanship, and we do not need to be adding fuel to that fire by adding the Supreme Court into the mix. Term limits would not have the intended effect. They would increase bias within the court, cause doctrine to change more frequently, and affect the original purpose of the court. Now, first let's talk about what that original purpose was. When the Constitution was written, lifetime appointments were a way to place justices in a sort of bubble. Having one job for life kept justices away from the political sphere. An article from The Atlantic explains, quote, "The idea of lifetime appointments seemed the best way to establish an independent judiciary, insulating judges from the political forces that might endanger constitutional rights and liberties. But now many believe that the pendulum has swung too far the other way, with a high court too reflective of past political fights and thus unresponsive to contemporary realities." Now, to simplify all of that, the Supreme Court at its core is meant to be bipartisan. No group should be favored. Justices are to uphold the law, and lifetime appointments were decided as a way to make sure justices were able to do just that. Now, some of my opponents may come up here and argue that the pendulum has swung the other way, and that the Supreme Court has become too politicized today, but that has to do with recent events rather than term limits. But let's say we implement term limits. What would this mean? What would this look like? Term limits have the potential to create more bias and impact the court, removing them from the bubble of lifetime appointments. Having justices change every few years would reflect the political position of the president who appoints them. Term limits would cause the court to swing between political parties, much like our Congress functions now. Multiple studies done by the Texas Law Review show that, quote, "Even a small degree of loyalty or ideological alignment between a president and his or her chosen justice can introduce substantial doctrinal instability in a term limit system." This is all based off of a popular model that's been proposed, where justices would have an 18-year term limit, and one justice would be swapped out every 2 years. But this idea holds the same with other proposed term limits. We saw how only 2 Supreme Court nominations can drastically impact the court. Imagine 4 appointments made by one president and how that can impact the court and make it more susceptible to bias. And this potential for bias ties directly into doctrinal change. Frequent turnover of justices means frequent turnover of rulings. Vanderbilt University did a study in which they simulated how often doctrines would have changed since the 1970s if term limits had been in place. They found that, quote, "Term limits are likely to have a substantial detrimental effect on doctrinal stability. A case could go from being a sure winner to a sure loser over the course of a single election." Former President Donald Trump nominated 2 conservative Supreme Court justices, and we saw what those changes caused. For the first time, a major precedent was discarded, creating shockwaves across our country and within our government. If we enact term limits for justices and have them switch out as frequently as Congresspeople, it would be just like our lawmaking process now, where decisions and laws are constantly being changed and nothing gets done. And in this scenario, change is not always a good thing, and the obvious solution isn't always the best one. So for that reason, justices of the Supreme Court of the United States should not have term limits. The evidence is clear and shows that term limits will negatively impact the court, increase bias within the system, along with frequent doctrinal changes. The overturning of Roe v. Wade showed us that there is a need for change within the Supreme Court, but term limits are not the solution to the problem. I know that was a lot of information, so I'll go ahead and open up the floor for questions.
Hi, great speech, thank you. My question is, so if we say, okay, we're not gonna enforce term limits, do you think the selection process of Supreme Court judges should be more strict or more comprehensive?
We do already have a strict, vetting process for justices, but I do agree that there should be stricter vetting in place, especially, in the case of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is the most recent Supreme Court nominee, she was almost overqualified for the position, whereas other Supreme Court justices, such as, I forgot her name, the other one, other Supreme Court justices seem to fall short. They don't have the same qualifications, they don't have the same clerking experiences. So I definitely think Supreme Court justices, if we are going to continue with lifetime appointments, should be held to higher standards.
You spoke briefly about how it's very important that the Supreme Court remains bipartisan, that they are a neutral party. But with the system you're proposing, you're essentially saying that the short-term limits will make the system worse. But doesn't inherently having judges that are elected for life mean that any judge that is heavily in favor with a president or is very heavily partisan one way or another, if they are elected, then they will be there for life, therefore impacting the court far more severely?
I totally understand what you're saying, and the argument that I was trying to get at within my speech is, obviously, former President Trump was able to nominate 2 Supreme Court justices, and immediately afterwards, we saw this big shift. We saw this lean towards conservatism within the Supreme Court, and obviously following the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now, hypothetically, if we were to put these term limits in place with justices switching out all the time, we would just see constant, like I mentioned, doctrinal change. If we're constantly switching out justices all the time, and we have a left-leaning judge versus a right-leaning judge versus a moderate, in and out, much like how our Congress works. The House of Representatives and the Senate is also always leaning certain ways depending on who's elected, who's appointed. So if we were to instate term limits for our Supreme Court justices, the same thing would be happening. And as soon as we get more left-leaning judges into place, doctrine would turn more left-leaning and things would be overturned, just like the laws that we have now. All right, well,